Hi, this is Pat Johnson, your psychology instructor, and in this mini lecture we're going to talk about classical conditioning, and we're going to go over Ivan Pavlov's example of classical conditioning with his dogs. Now, there are a couple definitions of classical conditioning. One that's in your textbook says a type of learning in which we learn to link two or more stimuli and anticipate events. Another example of a definition of classical conditioning is a type of involuntary learning where a neutral stimulus is paired with a stimulus that already elicits a response, and the previously neutral stimulus elicits the same response. Now, if you're typical of most students, you're going to be sitting there going, what does that mean? Well, we're going to break it down and make it simple, and by the time we go through Pavlov's example of classical conditioning, both of those definitions will make sense. So, Ivan Pavlov, who was he? He was a Russian physiologist, and his field of study was digestion. And he was so good at the study of digestion that he actually won a Nobel Prize for this research in 1904. The problem was that the laboratory dogs that were part of his research started messing up, and it really frustrated Ivan. And so here's a picture of Ivan Pavlov, and here's a picture of one of his many dogs. And yes, that's an actual stuffed dog. I guess they took it to a taxidermist, and it's at the Ivan Pavlov Museum in Russia. So here's the setup. And the dog was secured into a frame so that it couldn't move around a whole lot. And this tube collected saliva. Now, actually, that tube was surgically implanted into the dog's cheek, and we saw that in the picture of the dog. And then the dog would be presented with food. In this case, Pavlov used meat powder. I guess they didn't have commercial dog food in 1904. And the saliva would go down this tube. It would be collected, and there would be a drum that would actually record the amount of saliva. The researchers would be behind this screen, and they would be watching the dog but trying not to interfere with the dog going about its salivating to the meat powder. All of this was going on quite well. The scientist Pavlov and his colleagues were measuring the saliva, but soon they noticed that the dog started salivating to stimuli other than meat powder. So the dog started salivating just when the bowl was put out. The dog started salivating when a researcher walked into the room. The dog started to salivate to all sorts of stimuli that preceded the presentation of the meat powder. And at first, Ivan was a little bit ticked off, but he's a famous physiologist. He's a good researcher, and he wanted to know what was going on. So one of Pavlov's many truisms is don't become a mere recorder of facts, but try to penetrate the mystery of their origin. And that's a real good proverb to live by for any student. So let's take a look at what was happening. Terms I need you to remember for Pavlov's example of classical conditioning, and we will use these as we study all the concepts in classical conditioning, are US is going to be our abbreviation for unconditioned stimulus. And remember, conditioned meant learned, so unconditioned means not learned. So an unconditioned stimulus is going to be a stimulus that doesn't have to be learned, that we already know. An unconditioned response is going to be a not learned response to a not learned stimulus. And then a conditioned response, a CS is a conditioned response, so this is where learning comes in. So when we're talking about a conditioned stimulus, this is the learned stimulus. And then a conditioned response is a response that is acquired through classical conditioning. So we're going to be using these 4 abbreviations, US, UR, CS, and CR quite frequently. And you can always go back to this slide to remember what they mean. So this is what happened. Here's what we know before conditioning. Food causes salivation. It causes salivation in dogs. It causes salivation in humans. No parent has to teach their baby to salivate when they put food in the baby's mouth. The food is going to cause the baby to salivate, and that's just a natural response. Nothing is learned. So we call the food a US, or unconditioned stimulus, a not learned stimulus, causing a UR, an unconditioned response. Again, there is no learning. This is before conditioning. This is what is already occurring naturally. We can also test our subject and give them a neutral stimulus. In this case, Pavlov used a bell or a gong, and if I was to ring a bell in front of you, it would just probably cause you to be curious or perplexed. Nothing's going to happen. And the same thing happened in the Pavlov example. So we have the bell going off, which is neutral, and there's no salivation, there's no response at all. The bell is meaningless, it's a neutral stimulus, so no response is occurring. Now, during conditioning, this is what Pavlov found out. If he presented, again, that bell used to be a neutral stimulus, so if he presents a neutral stimulus right before the food, in other words, a stimulus that naturally causes a response. So pair bell plus food and we get the unconditioned response. Bell plus food and we get the unconditioned response. Bell plus food and we get the unconditioned response. Remember, it's the food that is causing the salivation. But look what we're doing. Right before that food is presented, we are giving the dog a neutral stimulus. And in that dog's brain, involuntarily, that link is being made between the neutral stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus. That dog's brain links those two stimuli, and then that bell has become a conditioned stimulus. In other words, that conditioned stimulus now causes salivation, except we call it a conditioned response, a CR, because the dog has learned, remember conditioned means learned, the dog has learned that the bell means food is coming. So the bell is a conditioned stimulus, we call that our CS, a conditioned stimulus causing the conditioned response. And that's where the actual learning has occurred, is by pairing that bell with our unconditioned stimulus, and pretty soon the bell means the same thing. So it's a conditioned stimulus causing a conditioned response. So let's go back to those big hairy definitions we had. Classical conditioning, a type of learning in which we learn to link 2 or more stimuli and anticipate events. So here's the 2 stimuli that are being linked, and the dog is anticipating from the bell ring that food is probably coming. So we've made this definition meaningful. Now let's go on to our even bigger definition. And although this one sounds even more complex, it's actually a really good definition to tell us what's going on in classical conditioning. So classical conditioning is a type of involuntary learning. We know that only involuntary responses are classically conditioned. A type of involuntary learning where a neutral stimulus, that bell, is paired with a stimulus that already elicits a response. So the Bell is paired with the food, and the food already elicits the response of salivation. And the previously neutral stimulus, the bell, elicits the same response. So now the bell is causing the same response. So we have both definitions making sense. So it would look something like this. We could say the bell is the conditioned stimulus. That's what came first. It used to be neutral. We have paired it, thus the plus sign, with food. Food is the unconditioned stimulus, and the food causes an unconditioned response. Now the bell, if we pair the bell and the food enough times, pretty soon the bell causes the same response, except now we call it a conditioned response. Okay? Okay, so let's do that again, and here's the easiest way to figure out a classical conditioning situation. First of all, figure out what is your response, because responses are easy to pick out. In this case, the dog salivating is the response. The food preceded the response. So we know food is a stimulus, and our food causing salivation, well, that's not learned. So we know that this must be an unconditioned stimulus, and this must be an unconditioned response. So we're actually working backwards. We're starting with the easiest thing, the salivation, and the food preceded the salivation, and then the bell preceded the food. So we have the bell, which used to be neutral, precedes the food. So the bell now becomes the conditioned stimulus. The conditioned stimulus plus the unconditioned stimulus yields the unconditioned response, and we pair that enough times. Bell plus food equals salivation, and pretty soon bell equals salivation. So again, salivation is our conditioned response. And on a test, it would just look like this. So what's our response? We're going to start with our response, and our response is salivation. And we know salivation is some type of response. What preceded the salivation before there was any learning? The food did. So we have food causing salivation, and food is a type of stimulus. Now ask yourself, does food causing salivation, is that something that has to be learned? No, that's natural. So this is an unconditioned stimulus causing an unconditioned response. Now, to have classical conditioning, what we do is before we give the dog food, we make a noise or ring a bell, whatever you want to call it. The bell used to be neutral, but if it's paired enough time with the food, it takes on the same ability to cause salivation. In other words, the dog has learned that the bell means food is coming. So the bell or the noise is our conditioned stimulus, and it now causes salivation, and salivation to the bell is a conditioned response. All right, so important things to remember is conditioned equals learned, unconditioned equals not learned, and only involuntary responses can be classically conditioned. So use this mini lecture a few times and go back to this one. It will help you when you are trying to recall what classical conditioning is all about, and you can always go back to the Pavlov's dog example.